first thing I remember when the lights went out was the smell. Not the usual rotten pumpkin and cheap cigarette smoke of a typical Halloween night, but something metallic and thick, like copper and bad pennies. I wasn't just hearing the screams from the street anymore. I was hearing the ones in my head. The front door was locked, but the cheap plastic bowl, the one sitting empty where the candy should be, was rocking slightly, almost vibrating. And I absolutely knew, that whatever was outside hadn't come for a trick or treat. It had come for me. I thought I was smart. Honestly, I did. This year, I figured I'd finally beat the system. I live on Willow Creek Lane, the main artery for trick-or-treaters in the whole damn county. We get hundreds. Every year, I spend $50 on king-size Snickers and I'm out of candy by 7:30 p.m. This time, I'd planned. I bought a single, massive bag of the absolute worst, cheapest caramel-flavored taffy I could find. The kind that rips out fillings and tastes like chemicals. My plan was to hand out the good stuff until 7 p.m., then switch to the dental floss killers for the late shift. Then, I would just lock the doors, turn off the lights, and enjoy my leftover good candy and a horror movie. Simple, right? It was about 7:05 p.m. when the last good Snickers bar vanished. I went into the kitchen, grabbed the massive orange plastic bowl filled with the heinous taffy, and set it on the small table by the front window. I flipped the porch light off, grabbed the remote, and settled onto my worn, leather sofa. Peace. The first knock came 15 minutes later. Hard and deliberate. Not the timid little taps of a child. "Sorry, guys, lights are off," I muttered to the empty room. "Take a lousy taffy and move along." Then came a scraping sound, like fingernails dragging across the wood of the door frame. It stopped my heart for half a beat. I sat up straight, peering through the small peephole, careful not to let my shadow fall across it. Nothing. Just a kid in a generic vampire cape, maybe 12 years old, standing alone on the porch, but his hands weren't reaching for the bowl. They were hanging stiffly at his sides. His head was tilted down. "Go on, kid," I whispered. "Take one." He didn't move. A wave of cold, heavy unease washed over me. This wasn't a normal trick-or-treater. This was the kind of kid who gets dared to stand in one spot until someone opens the door. The lights of the neighbor's house cast long, distorted shadows across my lawn, making the bushes look like hunched figures. Then, I noticed it. He wasn't breathing rhythmically. I couldn't hear his breath at all, but his chest wasn't rising and falling, and the cape wasn't flapping in the cool autumn breeze. Suddenly, the kid raised his head. The mask he was wearing wasn't a vampire mask at all. It was a flesh-colored latex mask with blacked-out eyes, the kind you buy at a joke shop, but it was sagging in a way that suggested the face beneath it was smaller than it should be. Or maybe something worse. He didn't just look at the door. He looked directly into the peephole. I swear, he made eye contact through that tiny lens. And then, a sound came from him. It wasn't a word. It was a low, rattling inhale, like someone trying to breathe through a handful of gravel. It sounded like a gasp of pure desperation. I stumbled back from the door, my heart hammering against my ribs so hard I thought it might crack one. This wasn't a prank. I immediately checked the deadbolt, shoving the small security chain across the frame. My hands were shaking so bad I fumbled the lock 3 times. What the hell was that? I kept asking myself. I crept back to the window, pulling the edge of the sheer curtain back an inch. The figure was gone. The porch was empty. The taffy bowl sat there, untouched, a silent orange beacon in the dark. I tried to tell myself it was just a creepy teenager doing a bit, but my gut was twisting itself into a knot of pure dread. I was alone. My nearest neighbor, Mrs. Henderson, was deaf and always asleep by 7 p.m. I went into the kitchen and grabbed the biggest knife I owned. My dull, but heavy, chef's knife. I felt ridiculous holding a knife against a possible teenage prankster, but the metallic smell, the one I noticed earlier, seemed stronger now, clinging to the air inside the house. I checked the back door. Locked. Windows. Latched. I stood in the middle of my living room, the knife dangling, listening to the silence. The street noise had faded. It was late enough that the foot traffic had dwindled to almost nothing. That's when I heard the drip. It was coming from the dining room, just off the kitchen. One rhythmic, wet sound. My entire body went rigid. I hadn't left the tap running. I knew I hadn't. I raised the knife, stepping slowly toward the archway that leads into the dining room. The light was bad. Only the ambient yellow glow from the streetlights filtered through the thin curtains. Shadows stretched long and threatening across the walls. My mind was racing. If it's a break-in, they'd be making noise. They wouldn't be dripping. I reached the archway and slowly leaned in. My eyes adjusted. I scanned the table, the chairs, the small antique cabinet. Nothing. Then I looked down, and I saw the bowl. Not the candy bowl, but a different bowl. It was my mother's favorite ceramic mixing bowl, the light blue one. It was sitting upside down on the dining room rug, and the dripping wasn't water. It was dark, almost black in the dim light, and it was running slowly from beneath the inverted bowl. A silent scream caught in my throat. I felt like I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. The smell of copper was overwhelming now. It was blood. Thick, heavy blood. I thought about running. I thought about calling the police. But my feet were rooted to the floor. I needed to know. I needed to see what was under that bowl. With a trembling hand, I gripped the handle of the chef's knife so tightly my knuckles were white. I took one slow, deliberate step closer. Why did they put a bowl over it? What kind of sick game is this? I edged around the table, my eyes glued to the dark, widening puddle on the rug. I was close enough now to reach out. Is it an animal? Did a raccoon get in and get hurt? The rational part of my brain was desperately looking for a normal explanation. But the metallic taste in my mouth, the lingering image of the blank-eyed vampire kid, shouted otherwise. I leaned down, the knife held high, ready to swing. My fingers brushed the cold ceramic. I took a quick, shallow breath and flipped the bowl over in one swift motion. The sight that greeted me was not a wounded animal. It was a man's hand. Not a whole arm, just the hand. It was severed cleanly at the wrist, resting palm up on the rug. The dark blood was pooling around it. On the palm, pressed into the flesh like a brand, was a small, caramel-colored piece of cheap taffy. One of the ones I planned to hand out. I gasped. A loud, broken sound of pure horror. The knife clattered onto the hardwood floor, echoing deafeningly. And then, from the stairwell leading up to my second floor, I heard the single, unmistakable sound of a floorboard creaking. He wasn't outside. He was already in the house. My entire perspective flipped. I wasn't the hunter. I was the prey. My escape route, the front door, was 50 feet away, but the thing that had just left a severed hand on my dining room floor was now upstairs, somewhere in the dark. I ran. Not for the front door, but back into the kitchen, the only room with a functional window I could climb out of. My mind was screaming, but I was moving in slow motion. I reached the sink, yanked the window latch up, and started shoving the screen outward. It was stuck. Damn it, stuck. The creaking came again, closer this time. It was slow, deliberate. 1 step, 2 steps. I clawed at the window screen, my fingers tearing the thin mesh. I heard a soft thud behind me. I didn't dare turn around. I knew what that sound was. It was the sound of someone landing softly on the last stair. I gave the screen a final, desperate shove. It popped out with a loud thwack and tumbled onto the small back porch. Cold, fresh air rushed in. Salvation. I was scrambling up onto the counter, ready to dive headfirst into the garden when a voice, right behind me, whispered. It was low, gravelly, and terribly close. You should have given out the good candy, Jeremy. My heart didn't just pound. It stopped. Only one person in the world called me Jeremy. My brother. My twin brother, Michael. Michael, who vanished 5 years ago and was presumed dead. I twisted my neck, fear overriding all sense. Standing there was a figure in a blood-soaked jumpsuit, his face hidden beneath a flesh-colored latex mask with blacked-out eyes, the same mask the kid wore. He held a large, rusty meat cleaver in one hand, and in the other he held the vampire cape. "Happy Halloween, Ja," he rasped, and I knew. The hand on the floor wasn't a warning. It was the only trick-or-treater who didn't get a treat. The metallic smell, the one I couldn't place, wasn't copper. It was family. I lunged for the window, but it was too late. I felt the heavy, wet force of the cleaver coming down. Story 2. The bus shelter felt like a coffin made of cold, dirty glass. It was 1:17 a.m. on November 1st, meaning Halloween was technically over, but the atmosphere felt heavy and electric, like the night was still holding its breath. Every sound, a distant siren, the crunch of dry leaves under an unseen car tire, was magnified into a threat. I was waiting for the last eastbound bus, and I had this awful, sinking feeling that someone or something was waiting with me. I just finished a miserable, double-shift cleaning kitchens at the new downtown bar, the Wicked Witch. The whole place was decorated with fake cobwebs and grinning skull lights. Now, after 10 hours of scrubbing spilled pumpkin ale and dried fake blood, all I wanted was my cheap apartment and a hot shower. The streetlights here were sparse, old sodium lamps that cast a sickly yellow glow that didn't illuminate much. It just made the darkness around the edges look thicker and more predatory. I checked my phone. Dead. Of course it was. The charger port on my ancient phone is finicky, and it had died somewhere between scrubbing the fryer and mopping the sticky dance floor. So I was truly alone, with no way to call for help and no way to check the bus schedule. I just had to trust that the ghost line, the late-night service, was still running. I pulled my thin jacket tighter around me. The cold was sharp and biting. I kept looking up the empty street, expecting the familiar, lumbering shape of the 42 bus. But the street remained silent. Too silent. That's when I noticed the movement. Not a big movement, nothing dramatic. Just a subtle shift in the shadows across the street, near the entrance to the old, abandoned park. A figure seemed to peel itself away from the massive oak tree, where the darkness was deepest. It was tall, and very thin. Too thin, maybe. My first thought was a drunk stumbling home from a party. But drunks usually make noise. They yell, they sing, they trip. This figure was moving with an unnerving smoothness, almost gliding. I pressed my back against the cold, grimy glass of the shelter. I tried to look casual, pulling out an imaginary cigarette. Anything to make myself seem busy and unconcerned. But my whole body was screaming danger. The figure started walking, slowly, in my direction. It wasn't a purposeful walk, like someone heading somewhere. It was a slow, measured, patrolling walk, like a shark circling. I risked a quick glance. The streetlight hit the figure at a weird angle. I still couldn't make out a face, but I could see what they were wearing. A long, dark coat that swallowed all light, and a hat, a wide-brimmed fedora. Tilted down so far it concealed everything above the nose. My blood went ice cold. There are 1,000 innocent reasons why someone might be walking alone at 1:30 a.m., but none of them explained the way the figure stopped exactly at the curb directly across the street from me and just stood there. I could feel its presence like a weight on my chest. The silence between us was deafening. There was no traffic now, no wind, no distant noise. Just me, breathing too loud, and the shadowy watcher. Just wait for the bus. Just look away. Don't engage. Don't show fear. I stared straight ahead at the empty asphalt, trying to project an air of bored indifference. My stomach was churning with panic. I started counting the seconds in my head, focusing only on the rhythm. At the count of 57, a low, wet sound reached me. It sounded like someone slowly sucking the air through a narrow straw. It was faint, but unmistakable. I snapped my head toward the sound. The figure hadn't moved, but its head was tilted slightly. And then I saw the glint. It was a flash of silver, briefly catching the sickly yellow light. It was too thin to be a knife or a gun. It looked like a needle. A long, terrifyingly thin needle, reflecting the light in a sharp arc. My imagination immediately conjured a nightmare scenario. Syringes, chemicals, something being slipped into an unsuspecting victim. My mind screamed, "Get out of here, now." But if I ran, I would confirm that I knew he was there and that I was terrified. Running might initiate the chase. I decided to bluff. I stood up abruptly, making a show of looking at an imaginary watch on my wrist. I took 2 exaggerated steps away from the shelter, toward the corner, as if I were impatient with the late bus and was going to walk the rest of the way. The figure moved. It didn't run. It didn't even hurry. It just stepped off the curb and began to cross the street, not directly toward me, but angling toward the bus shelter, cutting off my only logical line of escape down the main road. My bluff had failed. It wasn't buying my act of impatience. It was moving in for the confrontation. I pivoted and bolted in the opposite direction, down a dark, narrow alleyway that I knew led through a small commercial block and eventually back out to the main street, 2 blocks down. It was a riskier path, darker, with more places to hide, but I felt like the main street was too open, too exposed. I didn't hear footsteps at first, just the frantic pounding of my own shoes on the damp concrete. I ran full tilt, weaving past overflowing dumpsters that reeked of stale beer and rotting food. I hit the end of the alley. I burst out onto a side street, and I stopped dead. I was on Miller Street. It was entirely residential and completely empty. There were no streetlights on this block at all. Only the faint porch lights of the houses provided any illumination, and that's when I heard the sound again. Behind me, back in the alley, the same slow, steady footsteps. Not running, but pacing. I looked back into the mouth of the alley. Nothing, no silhouette. But the sound was there. Closer now. How could it be so fast? It was across the street just a minute ago. I turned and ran down Miller Street, hugging the tall hedge line of the houses. My lungs were burning. I glanced over my shoulder and saw it. The tall, dark figure was now gliding out of the alleyway. It wasn't running, but its pace was unnatural, covering ground too quickly for a leisurely walk. The long coat seemed to billow slightly, absorbing the faint light. I noticed something else. The figure wasn't just tall. It was unnaturally elongated. Its arms seemed to hang down almost to its knees, and its head, under the brim of the hat, seemed to be tilted at an impossible broken angle. I felt a fresh wave of panic. This wasn't human. This was something out of the worst kind of Halloween nightmare. I pounded on a dark wooden fence, hoping to find a gate or an opening into a yard. Locked. All locked. Every house was dark and silent, their occupants safe and oblivious in their beds. I reached a corner and spun left, onto a street with slightly better lighting. I saw a small metal structure ahead, a newspaper delivery box. It was flimsy, but maybe it offered a moment's concealment. I ducked behind it, pressing myself against the cold metal. I tried to silence my breathing, but my chest was heaving. The footsteps slowed. They stopped. I could feel its presence just a few feet away, right around the corner of the small box. I squeezed my eyes shut, praying it would keep moving. Then, I heard a sound that was even worse than the wet sucking sound before. It was a quiet, deliberate scratching sound, like a sharp point being drawn across wood. It was scratching my name. On the metal post just inches from my head, I heard the needle-like object tracing letters. Slow, precise. L, Y, N, D, A. The scratching stopped. A long skeletal finger, encased in a dark leather glove, wrapped itself around the edge of the newspaper box. It moved slowly, pulling itself into my line of sight. I bit down hard on my own hand to stifle a scream. The figure peered around the metal box. Its face was still obscured by the hat brim, but I could see its mouth. It was a thin, stretched line of pale skin, and it was smiling. The smile wasn't cheerful. It was wide and fixed, showing an unnerving number of sharp, tiny teeth. And then, I finally saw the glinting object it held. It wasn't a needle. It was a massive, ornate hat pin, maybe a foot long, with a deadly sharp point, and as it leaned closer, It whispered, the gravelly voice echoing in my ear. "Linda, you forgot to check the schedule. The last bus leaves at midnight." If the last bus left at midnight, then why did it wait for me? I didn't wait for the answer. I exploded from behind the box, kicking wildly at the figure's legs and scrambling blindly down the street. I ran toward the faint hope of a light at the end of the block, knowing that whatever was chasing me wasn't interested in tricks, and it certainly wasn't interested in treats. It was interested in the thrill of the chase. And I was losing. Story 3. I always knew isolation was a bad idea for someone with my history, but when I rented the old hunter's cabin for Halloween weekend, I told myself it was for the quiet, for the writing. The truth is, I just wanted to disappear. I wanted a place where the shadows weren't just caused by bad lighting, but by the natural thickness of the woods. A place where no one would knock on my door, not even for candy. The cabin was 2 hours north of the city, sitting in a clearing that was almost too large, making the surrounding forest feel less like protection and more like a looming, green wall. The air, even at 5 p.m., was heavy with the smell of pine and damp earth. It was October 31st, and the sky had been that bruised, metallic gray all day. I'd spent the late afternoon unpacking my single backpack and my box of research notes, a ridiculous, paranoid collection of articles about small-town disappearances and urban legends. I convinced myself this research was for my next novel. As the sun finally dipped, plunging the clearing into a deep, unsettling twilight, the real sounds of the woods began. The hoot of an owl, the snap of a twig that might have been a deer, or might have been something walking upright. My anxiety, which I usually keep tethered like a nervous dog, was already gnawing at its leash. I went through my security routine. The front door was solid wood, but the lock felt flimsy. I jammed a kitchen chair under the handle, just for my peace of mind. The 4 windows were small and grimy, but the latches held. Everything seemed secure, if depressingly ancient. I settled down with my lukewarm coffee and tried to write. I focused on the screen, letting the words become a shield against the creeping darkness outside. That's when the first impossible sound occurred. It wasn't a branch or an animal. It was a noise that shouldn't exist in this cabin, or any cabin. It was the sound of a single, slow-turning clock hand. Tick. My head snapped up. I scanned the small, cluttered room. I hadn't brought a clock and the power was out here, so the old, dust-coated digital clock on the shelf was just a dead black box. Tock. It sounded like it was coming from the kitchen wall, just behind the small, rusty stove. Loud and deliberate. The kind of sound a grandfather clock makes in an empty manor. But there was no clock. I knew there was no clock. I slid my chair back, the legs scraping loudly on the wooden floor. My heart was pounding a frantic rhythm against my ribs. It's my tinnitus. I tried to rationalize. It's a sound in my head. It's the stress. I crept into the tiny kitchen, grabbing the heavy, iron skillet from the rack above the counter. My hands were sweating so badly the skillet handle felt slick. I pressed my ear against the cold plaster wall where the sound seemed strongest. Tick, tock. It was undeniable, clear and precise right on the other side of that thin wall. What is on the other side of the wall? I remembered seeing a small, boarded-up pantry when I first looked at the cabin. The landlord had mentioned it was sealed off because the back wall was unstable. I hadn't given it a second thought. But now, is someone back there? Playing a sick game? I slowly ran my fingers over the seam where the plaster met the wood frame. It felt smooth. Sealed. There was no way through. But the clock sound, it was still there. It was driving me insane. I backed away from the wall, clutching the skillet. My mind started sprinting down dark corridors of thought. If it's a person, they're trapped. If it's not a person, I grabbed my flashlight and shined it around the room again. I needed a weapon, something better than a dirty old skillet. I found a tire iron I'd left leaning against the fireplace, my contingency plan for a flat tire on the way up. I stood there, paralyzed, watching the kitchen wall. The ticking continued, steady and mocking. Then the ticking changed. It didn't stop. It just went from the sound of a slow clock to the sound of fingernails tapping against wood. It was still coming from behind the wall, but now it sounded like a frantic, desperate rhythm, a message. I ran to the front door, yanking the chair out from under the handle. I hesitated. If I ran outside, into the dark, into the woods, I'd be even more vulnerable. And if this was just a delusion, an auditory hallucination brought on by exhaustion and my own neuroses, running would just confirm that I was losing it. I decided to stay. I had to know if the tapping was a real, physical thing. I raised the tire iron and brought it down hard on the kitchen wall. Crack! Plaster dust exploded into the air, and a large, jagged hole appeared right where the tapping had been coming from. The tapping stopped instantly. I held my breath, peering into the dust-filled hole. The flashlight beam cut through the debris. What I saw inside wasn't a pantry or a trapped person. It was a narrow, dirt-floored space, maybe 3 feet wide. And on the opposite wall of that small space, there was a shelf. And on that shelf was a collection of objects. Small, personal things. A child's shoe, a tarnished silver locket. And sitting right in the middle, still swinging slightly from the force of my blow, was a metronome. A wind-up wooden metronome, the kind musicians use. It was old and dark, but here's the thing that made my blood freeze in my veins. It wasn't running. The pendulum was perfectly still. I scrambled back, dropping the tire iron with a deafening crash. If the metronome wasn't running, if it was perfectly stationary, then where was the ticking coming from? I looked around the cabin wildly. I was alone. I was completely and utterly alone. My gaze fell on the front door. My chair was still lying on the floor where I'd yanked it away, but the door itself looked different. The small, square glass pane at the top of the door, the one I had checked and found locked an hour ago, was now subtly ajar. Not broken, just unlatched. I didn't remember unlatching it. Had I been so distracted by the ticking that I'd undone my own security? Did I do that? I walked slowly toward the door. I reached up and carefully pushed the pane closed. Clicked into place. Secure. I backed away. And then, I heard the sound of the pane being slowly, deliberately unlatched again. It was a quiet click. I stared at the glass square. My reflection stared back, wide-eyed and terrified. Is someone outside, just messing with me? I rushed to the window beside the door and ripped back the curtain. No one, just the dark, silent clearing. The full moon had risen, bathing the outside in a cold, blue-white light. Everything looked normal. But the door pane clicked open a third time. I didn't panic this time. I felt a sudden, cold surge of adrenaline-fueled clarity. I grabbed the tire iron and smashed the glass pane completely, creating a gaping hole in the door. The sound was explosive. I shoved the tire iron through the hole, waving it wildly outside. Get out of here. I see you. I screamed into the night. Silence. Absolute silence. Nothing in the woods moved. I slumped against the door, breathing hard, the adrenaline draining away, leaving me weak and shaking. I was safe. For now. I'd scared them off. I looked at the shattered glass and then at the hole I'd made in the kitchen wall. My own hands had created all the danger I was now facing. And then I saw the footprints. They weren't outside. They were inside the cabin. Small, wet tracks running from the base of the back wall, the wall with the broken pantry, across the floor and stopping right at the front door. They were too small to be my own boots, and they looked like someone had walked through dirt. But wait, how could the tracks be wet? It hasn't rained in days. I bent down, touching a print near my foot. The moisture wasn't water. It was thin and dark. It smelled faintly of copper. My brother's research flashed into my mind. The small-town legend about a man who trapped trespassers in his home on Halloween, sealing them behind false walls. I didn't hear a sound this time. I just felt the shift in the air pressure behind me. I spun around, raising the tire iron. Standing in the kitchen archway, right beside the hole in the wall, was a figure. Small, hunched, and covered head to toe in black, damp mud and dark water. The eyes were wide and milky white, and in its hand, it held a small, antique, wooden metronome. It wasn't ticking, but the thing was gently squeezing the ancient, wet wood in its hands. And as it squeezed, a faint, rhythmic sound began to leak out. It wasn't a clock. It was the sound of its muddy, grasping hands slowly crushing the wood. And I suddenly realized the truth. The sound wasn't coming from the metronome. It was coming from the figure's chest. A slow, labored sound, like a dying heart trying to keep pace. Is this what was trapped behind the wall? Why did the landlord seal it? It took a slow, agonizing step toward me, and I saw that its feet were bare, caked in wet, reddish mud, the same mud on my floor. And I knew, with sickening certainty, that I wasn't going to survive this night alone. Story 4. You think you know your neighborhood. You really do. After living on Elm Street for 18 years, I knew every cracked sidewalk, every porch swing squeak, and every resident's schedule, especially on Halloween. But nothing prepares you for the moment when the mundane suddenly cracks open and shows you the rot underneath. It was 9:45 p.m., the night was turning cold, and I was about to find out that the man I'd waved to every morning for a decade was not just eccentric. He was a collector. My name is Marcus. I was stuck handing out candy this year because my girlfriend, Sarah, was visiting her sister. So I was bored, sitting on my porch steps, watching the last stragglers. Most of the serious trick-or-treating had ended, leaving behind a few older teenagers looking for easy targets, their cheap costumes already drooping. My eyes kept drifting across the street to Mr. Abernathy's house. Abernathy was a retired photographer, maybe 70, and intensely private. He never decorated, never opened his door, and his house was always shrouded in a permanent twilight, his heavy velvet curtains drawn shut. Tonight, however, was different. Abernathy's porch light was on, a single, weak bulb that looked like a yellow eye blinking in the gloom. And sitting right in the middle of his impeccably manicured lawn was a single, old-fashioned camera tripod. No camera on top, just the tripod, its thin metal legs sunk into the damp grass. It was weird. Abernathy never put anything in his yard. Then I saw the two kids approach his house. They were dressed as generic ghosts wearing oversized white sheets. They looked about 9 or 10. They hesitated at the foot of his steps. One of them, the smaller ghost, said something I couldn't hear, and then the other one, clearly the braver leader, walked up the steps and timidly knocked. A sound that seemed swallowed instantly by the heavy door. Nothing happened for a long time. Then, the porch light blinked off. The kid in the lead turned back, shrugging his sheet-covered shoulders at his friend. They started walking back down the steps, clearly disappointed by the lack of candy. And then the light blinked back on. This time, the door cracked open. Just an inch. Abernathy's face wasn't visible, but I saw a hand emerge. It wasn't a wrinkled old man's hand. It was gloved. A thick, black leather glove. The hand held something small and white. It looked like a photograph. The leading kid reached out a hesitant, sheet-covered hand and took the photo. The gloved hand instantly retreated, and the door clicked shut with an ominous finality. The porch light stayed on. The two kids stood there, staring at the photo. After a moment, the smaller ghost ripped his sheet off his head and started crying. Hard, racking sobs. His friend threw the photo onto the ground and pulled his friend away, running full speed down the street, disappearing into the dark. I was instantly on my feet. What in God's name did he give them? I crossed the street, moving with a forced casualness that masked the frantic anxiety churning in my stomach. I reached the spot where the boys had stood. The paper was still lying there, face up, illuminated by the sick yellow light of the porch lamp. I reached down and picked it up. It was an old, black and white print, glossy and thick. The photo was of two small boys. They were standing in front of this very house. They were dressed as a cowboy and an astronaut. They were smiling, maybe 7 years old. Their faces were bright and innocent. The print was dated exactly 5 years ago, Halloween night. My blood went cold, not because of the photo itself, but because of the sharp, black marker line drawn across the top. It wasn't a censor line. It was a countdown, 5 out of 10. I looked up at Abernathy's house. The upstairs window, which was usually dark, now had a faint, pulsing red glow coming from behind the heavy curtains. I knew then that those crying children weren't just scared. They had seen themselves in the photo. Or rather, they had seen their older brothers, the ones who went missing 5 years ago. And Abernathy was telling them, in the sickest way imaginable, that he was collecting 10. He was halfway done. I had to see what was in that house. I couldn't call the police and tell them, "My neighbor gave a crying child a picture of his missing brother, and I think it's a countdown." They would just dismiss it as Halloween paranoia. I looked around. The street was empty. The carnival of the night had packed up. I walked around to Abernathy's backyard. The back door was old, weathered wood without a knob, secured only by a rusty bolt set high on the frame. It was clearly a storage entrance. I found a loose brick under a decorative bush and smashed it against the bolt. It took 3 painful, jarring blows, but the bolt finally snapped with a loud metallic shriek. I slipped inside. The air was stifling. The smell was worse than anything I could have imagined. Not metallic, like blood, but cloyingly sweet, like old, dusty formaldehyde mixed with decaying flowers. I was in a small utility room. Directly ahead, a narrow, dark hallway led deeper into the house. I pulled out my phone. Thank God I hadn't let mine die, and used the flashlight. The first thing I saw in the hallway was a series of hooks running along the wall, and hanging from the hooks like coat racks were costumes, not just cheap plastic ones. These were high-quality, tailor-made costumes. A meticulously rendered spacesuit, a pristine pirate outfit, a full cowboy getup, and each one had a small, handwritten tag tied to the sleeve. The tags held names and dates. I walked past them, my stomach twisting. The names didn't register at first, but the dates were all October 31st, spanning the last 10 years. I reached the end of the hall, which opened into a massive, dark living room. The red pulsing light was stronger here. It was coming from the center of the room. It was a darkroom, a makeshift photographic darkroom, constructed right in his living space. The light came from a single, low-hanging red bulb, and under that light, on a long stainless steel table, was the collection. It wasn't a stack of photos. It was an assembly line of horror. There were 10 small glass jars lined up perfectly, and in each jar was something floating in a murky, yellowish liquid. They were human eyeballs, preserved. Each jar had a small label affixed to the bottom. The label matched the names on the costumes. He wasn't collecting pictures. He was collecting the eyes that witnessed his final, twisted frames. I felt bile rising in my throat. I backed away slowly, trying to keep my breathing silent. My foot hit something soft and heavy. I shined the light down. It was a large, black velvet cloth draped over something low to the floor. I swallowed the scream that tried to escape and pulled the cloth back. Underneath was a life-sized, articulated wooden mannequin. It was sitting in an old velvet chair, posed as if waiting for a portrait. The head was tilted back slightly. The face was eerily smooth, but Abernathy had carefully replaced the mannequin's glass eyes with 2 preserved, actual human eyes. They stared blankly at the red ceiling. And on its lap was a small sign, handwritten in neat, calligraphic script. Number 10, ready for framing. I knew then what the tripod outside was for. It wasn't for his camera. It was the final, horrible stage of his process. He took the eye, framed the body in the tripod, and then simply left the scene. I realized with shattering clarity that Abernathy hadn't just given the boy a photograph. He had gone outside, stood behind the tripod, and given the picture before they saw him. He was marking his territory, counting down his final slots. Suddenly, I heard the sound of the front door being unlocked, the heavy deadbolt sliding back. I didn't wait. I turned and sprinted back through the hall, tearing past the hanging costumes. I threw myself against the back door, stumbling out into the cool night air. I ran down the street, not stopping until I reached my own porch. I collapsed onto the steps, trying to control the ragged, desperate gasps escaping my throat. When I finally regained enough composure, I looked back at Abernathy's house. The porch light was still on. The tripod stood perfectly still on the lawn. And standing right beside the tripod, looking across the street directly at my house, was Mr. Abernathy. He was wearing his usual cardigan, and he was holding the single, pristine, black and white photograph I had left on his lawn. He didn't move. He didn't wave. He simply lifted the photograph up to his eyes, studied it for a long moment, and then slowly tore it in half. His action told me everything. I was his new subject. The collection wasn't done. It had just reset. I was now a part of the local history, just waiting for my costume. Story 5. I never believed in cursed places, not really. I'm a realist. I work construction. I deal with faulty wiring, cracked foundations, and cheap plaster, not ghosts. But the house on Hemlock Ridge was different. It sat vacant for 30 years after the whole family vanished. Nobody dared go near it, especially not on Halloween. That, of course, made it the perfect target for me and Leo. We weren't looking for ghosts. We were looking for the safe everybody rumored the old man left behind. It was 10:30 p.m. The moon was hidden behind a thick blanket of fog that had rolled in off the valley, turning the whole hillside into a monochromatic nightmare. We were dressed in dark overalls, our faces masked by cheap plastic skull masks we'd picked up just in case anyone saw us hiking up the hill. A perfect, crime-friendly Halloween disguise. The house itself was a crumbling Victorian mansion, its massive bay windows like broken, dark eyes staring out over the empty grounds. The air here was heavy and cold, thick with the smell of mold and wet decay. "You sure this safe rumor is solid, Vic?" Leo muttered, his voice muffled behind the mask. He was nervous, breathing shallowly. "Solid as a rock," I whispered back. Old man Crowley was a bootlegger during the Depression. He didn't trust banks. 30 years, nobody's been in here. That money's still sitting in the basement safe. Nobody's crazy enough to look. We found a loose panel under the porch, easy entry, just like the local legends suggested. We slipped inside, pulling the panel shut behind us. The darkness was immediate, absolute, and pressing. It felt like walking into the inside of a massive, cold mouth. We turned on our tactical flashlights. The interior of the house was a tableau of frozen time. Dust lay over everything in thick, undisturbed blankets. The furniture was covered in ghostly white sheets. It was unsettling, like visiting a cemetery indoors. The floorboards groaned under our weight, each step sounding like a gunshot in the oppressive silence. We moved toward the back of the house, where the basement access was supposed to be. "Hey Vic, look at this," Leo whispered, pointing his beam at a small table near the hall. On the table, sitting on a doily, was a single porcelain candy dish. It was clean, dusted, and filled to the brim with colorful cellophane-wrapped hard candies, the kind old ladies used to give out. We both froze. "That's impossible," I breathed. "This place hasn't been touched in decades. Who left candy here? And why is it clean?" Leo's voice was high with panic. "Forget it. It's a distraction," I snapped, though my own skin was crawling. I pushed past him. "Basement first. Come on." We found the basement door, heavy and iron-bound. It wasn't locked. It simply sat ajar, leaking a column of colder, heavier air from below. We descended into the black pit. The basement was stone and earth, smelling of deep-seated dampness. My flashlight beam cut through the gloom, revealing the usual assortment of abandoned horrors. Rusty tools, broken chairs, and deep cobwebs. We spotted the safe almost immediately. It was tucked into a small alcove in the stone wall, a large antique cast iron box with a heavy circular tumblers. "Jackpot. Told you?" I grinned, feeling a rush of adrenaline that washed away the earlier unease. Leo, the brains of our operation, knelt down immediately, pulling out his stethoscope and small lockpicking tools. "Give me 20 minutes. 30, tops. It's old, but it's thick." I stood watch, sweeping the beam around the massive room. It was then that I noticed the doors. The basement wasn't just a big open space. Running along one wall were 4 small, identical wooden doors evenly spaced. They weren't like closet doors. They were too thick, too short, and fitted with heavy iron sliding bolts on the outside. They looked like small personal cells. "Leo, what are these?" I whispered, my voice thick. Leo didn't look up. "No idea. Wine cellar, maybe." "Shoo, I'm on the second wheel." I approached the nearest door. It had a small, square peephole cut into the wood, covered by a rusty slide. I cautiously slid the cover back and peered through the gloom. Nothing, just a dark, small space. I moved to the next one. I slid the peephole cover open. As my eye adjusted to the darkness inside, I saw a reflection, a faint, wet gleam. I slammed the cover shut, my heart hammering. I didn't see a person. I saw an eye, a single, wet, open eye, staring directly back at me from the blackness inches away. It wasn't moving. It was just there. "We need to go, Leo. Now," I urged, grabbing his shoulder. "Almost there. Just a few clicks on the third wheel." "Don't rush me, Vic," he hissed. I couldn't shake the image of that staring eye. And the strange candy upstairs. I moved back toward the cells, my fear morphing into a cold, hard curiosity. I looked closer at the second door, the one with the eye. Around the perimeter of the peephole, I saw faint, dried streaks. They weren't dirt. They were old, dried fingernail marks, etched into the hard wood, like someone inside had desperately been trying to pull the cover open from their side. Then, I noticed something new. Underneath the door, there was a faint gap, and wedged in that gap, sticking out onto the dusty floor, was a small scrap of orange plastic. A candy wrapper. The same kind of hard candy wrapper from the bowl upstairs. My mind instantly connected the pieces, the fresh, clean candy bowl, the 30-year disappearance, the small cells. Crowley wasn't just a bootlegger. He was a collector. He would lure people in with the story of the safe, or perhaps just the lure of an empty house on Halloween. And then he would put them in these rooms, locking the bolt from the outside. And the candy wasn't a treat for visitors. It was a slow, cruel offering for the prisoners. But who was giving out the candy now? A sudden, sharp click echoed through the basement. Leo had cracked the safe. "Got it. Get the light," Leo exclaimed, pulling the heavy door open. I rushed to his side. Inside the safe, there was no stack of bills, no glittering gold. The safe was empty, completely, clinically empty. "No way," Leo stammered, shining his light into the small cavity. Then, Leo noticed something small and white tucked into the back corner of the safe. He reached in and pulled it out. It was a porcelain dish, the same kind of candy dish as upstairs, only this one was empty. And on the underside of the dish, written in thick old marker, were 2 words: the reward. Suddenly, the heavy iron basement door above us slammed shut with a seismic boom. The sound vibrated through the stone floor and straight into my bones. We were trapped. Leo screamed, dropping the dish. "Someone's here. They locked us in." I spun around, pointing my flashlight beam wildly at the single, narrow stone staircase. The light from my beam caught the heavy iron bar that was now slotted across the outside of the door. It was locked from above. We were sealed in the cellar with the cells. And then I heard a new sound, a soft, wet shuffling coming from behind one of the wooden doors. It wasn't a scared person. It sounded like someone dragging wet fabric across a stone floor. I focused my beam on the door with the eye. The bolt was still secured. And then, slowly, deliberately, the bolt on the outside of the door began to slide back. It was a rough, grinding sound of iron on iron. Someone or something was opening the cells from the outside, and that someone was in the basement with us. "Leo, run. Get behind the safe. Now!" I yelled, pulling out the small crowbar I kept in my kit. Leo scrambled behind the large metal safe. I stood in the middle of the room, shining my light on the wooden cell doors. The first door swung inward with a slow, agonizing groan. The room was completely dark. Then, two large, pale hands, slick with moisture and caked with reddish mud, gripped the door frame. Slowly, a figure pulled itself into the light. It was incredibly tall, hunched over, and draped entirely in what looked like 30-year-old, sodden, moldy clothes. Its eyes were huge, dilated black pools. Its skin was an awful, pasty white, stretched tight over the bones. The mouth was stretched into a wide, unsettling grin, and the figure smelled overpowering, like a mixture of rotten earth and sugar. It was what was left of Crowley's prisoner, the one who never got out, and in its pale, mud-caked hand, it held a bright, colorful hard candy, a sweet offering. The thing raised the candy toward the safe where Leo was hiding. It was hunting. But if Crowley put this thing in the cell and he's gone, who is the new jailer? I heard a faint, high-pitched whirring sound coming from above the locked basement door, a sound like an old tape recorder starting up. Then, a voice crackled through the vents, distorted and aged, but recognizable. It was the voice of an old man, low and pleased. "Welcome, boys. The treats are claimed. Now it's time for the reward." I realized the final, terrible truth. Crowley never left. The safe was empty because he had used the money to build his system, to automate his crime. He had set up a perpetual trap, powered by timers and weights, running the whole gruesome show from a hidden spot in the floorboards. The creature lunged toward the safe. I swung my crowbar blindly, hitting bone. A low, bubbling shriek erupted from the figure. I knew the fight was hopeless. I was trapped in a decades-old murder factory, locked in with the monster created by the original owner. Story 6. I never thought much about what people wore on Halloween. It's just fabric and plastic. Harmless fun. But that night, as I watched the man across the street, I realized that some people don't wear costumes to hide who they are. They wear them to become something truly terrifying, and once they become it, they never want to take it off. I was working security at the Cedar Crest annual Halloween block party. My job was simple: keep the drunk teens off the manicured lawns and make sure no one set off any fireworks. It was easy money, usually. The party was huge, spilling out onto 3 streets. There were hundreds of people, all masked and laughing. My designated patrol zone was the outer perimeter, near the old, abandoned theater on 14th Street. It was around 11:30 p.m. The party was winding down, and the fog machine they were using had coated the street in a cold, dense haze. I was walking past the theater's alleyway when I saw him. He wasn't dressed like a ghoul or a celebrity. He was wearing a meticulously crafted old-world jester costume, the kind with the tri-pointed hat, bells dangling, and a silk mask covering his face. It was detailed, expensive, and completely out of place at this suburban party. He was standing perfectly still in the alley entrance, his back to the street, looking deep into the shadow-filled passage. The small bells on his hat were silent, which was the first thing that struck me as odd. A jester should jingle. I approached him cautiously. "Hey, buddy, party's that way. You lost?" He didn't move. He didn't even twitch. I stepped closer, ready to escort him back to the main street. "Sir, I need you to move along, please." Then, the jester slowly turned his head. Not his body, just his head. It rotated on his neck in a slow, unnatural corkscrew motion. The mask covering his face wasn't silk. It was pale, tight leather. And it wasn't shaped like a traditional jester face. It was smooth, featureless, with only 2 small, uneven holes cut out for the eyes. Through those holes, I saw nothing but pure, unreflective blackness. It was like looking into two small, empty voids. And then, a sound finally came from him. It wasn't a joke or a laugh. It was a low, sibilant hiss, like air escaping a punctured tire. I instinctively backed up a step. "All right, just take it easy. Go enjoy the party." He reached a hand up to the leather mask. It wasn't a joke prop hand. It was thick and gloved. He placed his thumb and index finger into the eye holes and pulled very gently. The mask didn't stretch. It slowly peeled away from his face, making a sound like adhesive tape being pulled off skin. What was underneath was a disaster. It wasn't a face. It was raw, weeping flesh, tightly bound with surgical gauze and thick, looping thread. He had apparently removed his own face, or had it removed, and was wearing this horrifying bandage underneath the jester mask. He wasn't finished. From the folds of his elaborate silk costume, he pulled out a small glass vial. It was clear, filled with a pinkish liquid, and inside the liquid, floating gently, was a tiny, perfectly preserved human ear. He held the ear up, right in front of his mutilated face. "A trophy," he rasped, his voice strangely flat and unemotional. For the next frame, I didn't need any more context. This wasn't a costume. This was a monster at work. I immediately fumbled for the radio clipped to my belt, my hands shaking so badly I almost dropped it. "I need backup on 14th Street, by the theater alley. Code red. I have a major situation. Armed, possibly homicidal. He's disfigured." The jester didn't react to my words. He simply placed the vial back into his pocket and, with impossible speed, darted down the dark alleyway. He didn't run. He vanished into the fog. I took off after him, adrenaline overriding caution. I couldn't let him escape. If he had an ear, he had a victim. And if he was talking about a next frame, that meant he was still hunting. The alley was slick with moisture and littered with old, broken masonry. My flashlight beam bounced wildly off the dirty brick walls. I was running blind. I stopped in the middle of the alley, shining the beam ahead. Nothing. The alley opened onto a small, fenced-in courtyard behind the theater. I pushed through the rickety wooden gate. The courtyard was small, dominated by a large, rusted fire escape leading up the side of the building. I heard a soft, rhythmic sound coming from above, a gentle, musical clinking, the sound of those tiny jester bells. I looked up. He was climbing the fire escape, moving with a silent, spider-like agility that defied his bulky costume. He was heading toward an open, unlit window on the 3rd floor. I started scrambling up the rusty metal stairs after him. This is insane. I'm chasing a man with a missing face up a fire escape. I reached the 2nd floor landing and stopped to catch my breath. I looked down. The ground was a dizzying drop away. I saw the jester pause at the 3rd floor window. He leaned in, his gauze-covered face disappearing inside the black rectangle. Then, I saw a flash of light inside the room. Not my flashlight. A brief, intense white light, like a camera flash. A slow dread crept up my spine. What was he photographing? A muffled, high-pitched cry came from inside the room. It was instantly cut off. I launched myself up the final flight of stairs, slamming through the 3rd floor window frame. I landed hard on a dusty wooden floor. I was in the old theater's costume storage room. It was vast, filled with racks of moth-eaten gowns, cheap masks, and dusty props. The room was lit only by the faint spill of moonlight through the broken window. The jester was standing still about 20 feet away, near a tall wooden mirror. He was facing the mirror. He wasn't looking at me. He was looking at his reflection. He reached out a gloved hand to the mirror and slowly wiped away the dust. And then, I saw the true horror of his collection. Affixed to the glass around his head, like a grotesque frame, were dozens of human faces. They were thin, translucent pieces of skin, stretched and dried, pinned to the wooden frame with long silver taxidermy pins. Each one was a different expression: joy, shock, terror, sadness. He had captured the final moments of his victims. The jester turned and faced me. The gauze wrapping was gone. His skull was bare of any skin, just raw muscle and bone. But what shocked me into silence wasn't the exposed flesh. It was the new face he was holding. It was a young woman's face, pale, serene, and perfect. He was holding it up to the light, admiring it. "The new mask," he hissed, "a masterpiece of fear. But it needs a partner." He took a slow, deliberate step toward me. The silent bells on his hat remained fixed. I knew then that my security uniform was just the first layer he'd strip away. He didn't want my money or my possessions. He wanted my face. He wanted to capture the look of absolute terror, to pin it to his frame, and to wear it as his next costume. I raised my flashlight like a weapon, the beam shaking violently. My foot snagged on a pile of fabric, and I pitched forward, hitting the ground hard. When I looked up, he was standing over me. The new face, the beautiful dead woman's face, was resting on his shoulder, ready to be fitted over the exposed flesh of his skull. He lowered the taxidermy pin toward my eye. I didn't see the end. Story 7. I always hated Halloween decorations. Not because they were tacky, but because they felt too real in our neighborhood. We lived in a quiet, affluent suburb where everything was pristine, which only made the fake gore look more jarring and misplaced. This year, I swore I wouldn't let my neighbor, Gary, turn his house into a cheap slaughterhouse. I was wrong. I was deeply, horribly wrong. Gary was a middle-aged bachelor, a landscape architect, and entirely too enthusiastic about theatrical violence. Every year, his porch was a bloodbath. But this year, he'd started early. By October 28th, he had 2 life-sized figures slumped in his doorway, their plastic skins slick with something dark and glossy. "That's too much, Gary," I told him that afternoon. "It looks real. It smells real, frankly." He just smiled, a wide, unsettling grin. "That's the point, Martin. Realism is key. It's all about the texture of the paint. It's oil-based this year. Much better sheen. On Halloween night, I locked my doors, ignored the sparse knocks, and sat upstairs in my office, trying to block out the distant shrieks and laughter. It was 11:45 p.m. The street was mostly quiet now. I was just about to head to bed when I noticed the unusual light coming from Gary's front yard. It wasn't the usual strobe or black light. It was a single, powerful construction floodlight aimed directly at his porch. And there was a new figure. This one wasn't plastic. It was lying face down on the walkway, dressed in a faded vampire cape. The cape was dark, but the figure underneath was unmistakably human. And it was bleeding. Truly, deeply bleeding. My heart seized in my chest. I grabbed my phone, ready to dial 911, but then I hesitated. What if it's another one of his sick, realistic props? Gary had fooled me before. Calling the police on a prop would make me look like the neighborhood lunatic. But the floodlight, and the stillness. The figure wasn't just lying there. It was unmoving, like a discarded doll. I needed proof. I had to know for sure. I crept down my stairs, unlocked my front door, and stepped out onto the porch. The night air hit me with a sudden chill, and immediately, I smelled it. It wasn't the smell of cheap paint or corn syrup. It was the sharp, metallic tang of fresh, warm blood. It was unmistakable. It wasn't oil-based paint. It was real. I hurried across my lawn, stepping carefully around a dozen tiny, plastic pumpkin buckets. My eyes were fixed on the figure. I reached Gary's porch. I knelt beside the body. I didn't touch it, but I could see the thick, viscous pool gathering beneath the head. The skin on the neck was pale and waxy. The costume had been sliced open down the back, neatly, and the wound underneath was deep and wide, a precise surgical cut. This wasn't an accident. This was a homicide. I scrambled back, pulling my phone out, hands shaking so badly I couldn't hit the numbers. And then, I heard a sound from inside Gary's house. A soft, rhythmic scraping. It was coming from the living room window, just inches from where I stood. I dropped my phone on the cobblestones. I looked toward the window. It was dark, the curtains drawn, but the scraping continued. Scrape, scrape, slow and steady. I pressed my face against the glass, cupping my hands around my eyes to try and pierce the darkness inside. I saw him, Gary. He was standing over what looked like a makeshift workbench, lit by a single bare bulb. He wasn't looking out the window. He was focused entirely on his work. He was wearing an apron over his regular clothes, and his hands were covered in those familiar black gardening gloves he used for his landscaping projects. In his hands, he held a piece of human skin. It was a dark, broad piece, maybe the size of a dinner plate, and he was scraping something off the underside of it with a small, curved metal tool. He was tanning it, preparing it. My breath hitched, couldn't look away. I was watching a man turn human remains into something usable. He finished scraping and carried the piece of skin over to a large, aluminum drum sitting in the corner. He carefully lowered the skin into a bubbling, yellowish liquid inside the drum. The smell intensified, caustic chemicals mingling with that terrifying copper scent. As he waited for the skin to soak, Gary walked over to the corner of the room. He pulled back a hanging sheet, revealing something tall and unnerving. It was a mannequin. Not a cheap prop, but a professional, articulated display figure. It was dressed in a full, pristine skeleton costume, white bone segments sewn onto a black velvet suit. But the head wasn't a mask. It was a real human skull, mounted onto the mannequin's neck. He smiled at the figure, a genuine, affectionate smile. He then reached out and gently touched the skull's teeth. "Almost finished, old friend," I heard him murmur through the glass. His voice was calm, almost soothing. "Just need the cape." He then turned and walked directly toward the front door, toward me. I didn't wait. I scrambled backward, grabbing my dropped phone, and ran across the yard, back onto my own property. I didn't stop until I was inside, door bolted, heart pounding a violent rhythm against my ribs. I immediately called 911. My voice was a shaky, ragged whisper. "Homicide. My neighbor, Gary. I think he's killed someone. Please hurry. It's not a joke." The operator was calm, asking for the address. I gave it to her, my eyes glued to the dark pane of my front door. Just as I finished the call, I heard the subtle sound of his front door opening and closing. I peeked through the slit in my curtain. The construction floodlight was still blazing. Gary was standing over the body of the vampire. He bent down, and with unsettling ease, he peeled the crimson cape off the figure. It was dark, heavy velvet. He stood up, holding the cape. He didn't look at my house. He walked back inside, closing the door firmly behind him. I waited. 2 minutes later, the single light in the living room clicked off. The house was dark again. Only the floodlight remained, illuminating the still, lifeless body on the walkway. 10 minutes later, the first police car arrived, followed quickly by 2 more. The yard filled with blue lights and flashing chaos. The officers approached the body slowly, cautiously. They confirmed it was real. Homicide. They cordoned off the scene and broke down Gary's front door. They searched for hours. They found the drumming vat, the tools, the grotesque mannequin. But they never found Gary. The police chief came over to my house at 4 a.m., his face tired and grim. "Mr. Weston," he said, using my name. "We found the body, and we found what he was doing. But the suspect, Gary, he's gone. We sealed the neighborhood. He was just here." He walked back inside. I insisted, shivering, despite the blanket around my shoulders. The chief sighed. "We found evidence of a tunnel. He had an escape route prepared. But there's something else we found, right outside your property line. He pointed to a small, dark object sitting on my porch steps. It was a tiny ceramic trick-or-treat pumpkin. It wasn't mine. I hadn't put it there. And sitting inside the pumpkin, neatly folded, was a small square of dark, dried velvet, a swatch cut from the vampire cape. The chief knelt and picked it up with a gloved hand. It's a piece of the victim's costume. Why would he leave this here? I stared at the velvet. I knew exactly why he left it. Gary hadn't run away completely. He had used his escape route, but not before delivering his final, terrifying treat. He hadn't left me a clue about the crime. He had left me a tailor's sample, a message that he was still close, and that my own perfect, pristine lawn was the next canvas he intended to work on. The realization hit me like a physical blow. The chase hadn't ended with the police. It had just started. Story 8. The old cemetery was the perfect place to spend Halloween night. Not because I'm morbid, but because I'm a ghost hunter, the kind that uses high-tech gear, not cheap theatrics. I'm looking for electromagnetic anomalies, for real evidence. My current focus was the Whispering Hill Cemetery, famous for the Lost Choir legend. I set up my equipment right at midnight, when the veil between worlds is supposedly thinnest. But what I caught that night wasn't a lost spirit. It was something far worse. My main piece of gear is a highly sensitive audio recorder, the kind used by film producers. I also use a specialized EMF meter. The air was crisp, and the stillness of the cemetery was overwhelming. The only sound was the faint hum of my equipment and the sound of my own anxious breathing. I sat down on an overturned granite marker, adjusting the gain on the recorder. Testing. Midnight, November 1st. Whispering Hill. Seeking environmental influence. I kept my voice low, just above a whisper. The first 30 minutes were uneventful. Just the occasional spike on the EMF reader, likely interference from the city 2 miles away, and a whole lot of empty audio. I was about to pack up, feeling the usual disappointment, when the static began. It wasn't a sudden, jarring noise. It was a low, subtle hissing that crept into the headphones. My EMF meter, which had been silent, suddenly shot into the red. The needle slammed against the far right of the dial, shaking violently. "Whoa!" I murmured, my voice shaking a little. "Major spike. This isn't normal interference." I checked the audio levels. The hissing was getting louder, forming a dense wall of sound in my ears. I quickly engaged the noise reduction filter, trying to clear up the recording. The hissing retreated slightly, and that's when I heard the voice. It wasn't a typical EVP, electronic voice phenomenon, that usually sounds like a faint, disembodied word. This was clear. Too clear. It was a woman's voice. She was weeping. Low, desperate, ragged sobs that sounded incredibly close. I froze, heart hammering. Is someone else here? Is she hurt? I ripped the headphones off and scanned the moonlit cemetery. The shadows of the mausoleums were long and deceptive. Nothing. No one. I was alone. I put the headphones back on. The weeping was still there. I realized the sound wasn't coming from outside. It was coming through the microphone being broadcast directly into my recorder. "Can you hear me?" I whispered into the mic. "If you're in pain, please make a noise. Tap once for yes." The weeping continued for a solid minute, then abruptly stopped. It was replaced by a sound that made the hairs on my neck stand up. It was the sound of a phone ringing. An old, insistent, rotary-style ring. I checked my own phone. It was sitting on the ground beside me, silent. The ringing was only in the headphones. "What is that?" I asked the empty night. "Are you trying to call someone?" The ringing stopped. It was replaced by a dial tone. A long, flat tone. Then, I heard the sound of fingers moving quickly across a keypad. The quick, clean click-click-click of someone dialing a number. It was a full 10 digits. and as the dialing finished, I recognized the distinct sequence. It was my cell phone number. I snatched my phone up from the ground. It was still dark. No missed calls. No pending messages. The phone had never actually rung. The sound was solely in the recording. It was whatever was on the other end of that static calling me. I knew then this wasn't a ghost. This was a sophisticated, malicious intelligence. Something that could monitor my location, access my personal data, and broadcast it back to me through my own equipment. I whispered into the mic, my voice strained. "Who are you? How do you know that number?" The silence that followed was agonizing. The only thing transmitted now was the low, electric hum of the equipment. Then, the static returned, louder than before. And embedded in the static, a new sound began. It was a sound of a heavy metal object being slowly dragged across a rough, gravel surface. I looked at my EMF meter. The needle was still pegged in the red. But now it wasn't just shaking. The whole meter housing was vibrating slightly in my hand. The sound of the dragging was getting louder, closer, and I realized the direction it was coming from. It was moving along the main, crushed stone path of the cemetery, the path leading straight to my location. I threw the headphones down. I needed to pack up and get out of there. Now, this wasn't a seance. It was an ambush. I frantically started coiling the wires, shoving the recorder into its case. Every movement felt slow and clumsy. The sound of the dragging was now clearly audible without the headphones. It was a chilling, relentless sound. I risked a look up the path. The cemetery gate was about 40 yards away, and then I saw the figure. It was massive, a hulking silhouette moving slowly through the fog. It was bent low, dragging something heavy behind it. I couldn't make out any features, but the object it was dragging was long and dark. And as the figure moved, the metal sound was perfectly synchronized with its movements. I finally got my recorder into the bag. I turned to run, but my foot caught on the granite marker I'd been sitting on. I fell hard, my shoulder slamming against the cold stone. I scrambled backward, crawling until I hit the base of a large, moss-covered monument. I ducked behind it, my heart threatening to burst through my chest. The dragging stopped. The silence was immediate and thick. I held my breath. I could hear my own blood rushing in my ears. Then, a new sound came. It was a low, guttural sigh, right on the other side of the monument. It was so close, I could feel the faint tremor in the stone where it exhaled. I squeezed my eyes shut, praying. I felt like an animal caught in a snare. And then, a large, dark hand, covered in what looked like thick, wet clay, slowly curled around the edge of the monument. The fingers were unnaturally long and thick. The hand rested there for a long moment. Then the fingers began to scratch. A faint, grinding sound of ceramic scraping against stone. The creature wasn't trying to find me. It was simply waiting. And then, softly, deliberately, the voice returned. Not through the headphones, but a low, wet whisper that seemed to vibrate the air around me. "The receiver is broken, but I got your address. I'll hang up now." The hand retracted. I heard the dragging sound resume, but this time, it was receding, moving slowly back down the path toward the cemetery gates. I waited until the sound completely vanished, until the only thing left was the hum of the city and the wind through the pines. I finally stood up, shaking violently. I looked down at the granite monument. Where the hand had rested, scratched deep into the stone, was a symbol. It wasn't a word or a number. It was a chilling, geometric spiral. I didn't pack up. I ran. I burst through the cemetery gate, never looking back. The next morning, safely home in the terrible daylight, I reviewed the audio recording. I couldn't bring myself to listen to the voice again. But the final track had recorded one last sound, right as the dragging vanished. It was the distinct, clean click of the cemetery gate lock sliding shut. And then silence. Just the endless, suffocating static. I realized the creature hadn't just left. It had locked itself out. But it knew where I lived. And it had my number. Story 9. I always hated the sound of the wind chimes. My neighbor, old Mrs. Davies, insisted on having a massive set hanging right outside my bedroom window. They usually sang a maddening, cheerful, metallic tune. But tonight, on Halloween, the wind was dead still. And the silence from those chimes was far more terrifying than any noise they could have made. I felt like I was waiting for the other shoe to drop, or for something much worse to knock. My name is Finn. I'm a student, and I decided to spend Halloween isolated in my small rented duplex, far from campus parties. I had a nervous habit of counting things when I was stressed, and tonight, I was doing it constantly. Counting the floorboards, counting the shadows, counting the seconds between the non-existent gusts of wind. The real problem started at 8 p.m. The trick-or-treating rush was still on, but it was light, polite. Kids would knock, I'd hand out cheap chocolate, and they'd leave. Then came the third knock. It wasn't a child's knock. It was firm, slow, and strangely soft. It felt less like a request for candy and more like a gentle test. I looked through the peephole. A figure stood there in a heavy, dark coat, wearing a mask that was unnervingly smooth and white. It wasn't smiling or grimacing. It was blank. I opened the door, a forced smile on my face. Happy Halloween. Take 2. The figure didn't move. It just stood there. And then, I noticed it wasn't holding a candy bag. Its hands were empty, shoved deep into its coat pockets. "Did you forget your bag?" I asked, feeling a surge of awkwardness. The figure tilted its head, ever so slightly. And then, a sound came from beneath the white mask. It was a slow, distinct, and strangely dry swallowing sound, as if someone was trying to clear their throat of fine dust. I felt my smile vanish. I dropped 2 chocolate bars into its empty hands. "Enjoy!" I tried to close the door, but the figure put a foot on the threshold. Not aggressively, just firmly, stopping the door with a quiet, dull thud. "I'm all out of the good stuff." I lied, my voice tight. The figure didn't speak. It just raised its empty hands to the mask, and with 2 quick, precise movements, it removed the chocolate bars from its pockets, the ones I had just given it. It hadn't eaten them. It hadn't done anything with them. Why would it put them in its pocket only to take them out again? It dropped the candy onto my welcome mat, a deliberate soft plop. Then, it slowly reached up and pointed a gloved finger at the wood of my door. I looked where it was pointing, and I saw it, faintly etched into the paint, right next to the brass numbers of my address, was a small, perfect circle. I hadn't noticed that circle before. Was it always there? The figure retracted its finger, took its foot off the threshold, and walked silently away into the darkening street. It didn't look back. I slammed the door shut and bolted it. My mind was spinning. Why the circle? Why did it return the candy? What did it want? I went straight to the kitchen drawer and pulled out the sharpest thing I owned, a pair of heavy-duty 7-inch kitchen shears. Ridiculous, maybe, but they felt solid. I crept back to the door and scraped furiously at the paint until the circle was gone. I painted over the spot with the gray touch-up paint I kept in the hallway closet. I had to erase the mark. I went back to the counting. 1 minute passed. 5 minutes passed. The silence outside was getting thicker, more smothering. The chimes remained motionless. Then came the 4th knock. This one was different. It wasn't firm or tentative. It was a series of quick, light taps, right on the glass of the window high up where no normal person could reach. It sounded like someone tapping the glass with a thin, metal rod. My duplex is 2 stories. The only way to tap that high on the window would be from the roof or using an incredibly long ladder. I rushed to the window, peering through the slats of the blinds. Nothing. Just the empty, fog-shrouded street. The wind chimes still silent. I ran to the back door, checked the deadbolt. Locked. I checked the kitchen window. Locked. I stood in the middle of the living room, listening. My senses were on fire. I could hear my own pulse thundering in my ears. Then, I heard a sound from the ceiling directly above me. Faint, grinding noise, like sandpaper rubbing against plaster. Slow and steady. Someone is on my roof. They're sanding my roof? The sheer absurdity of the thought didn't lessen the terror. I knew I couldn't stay on the ground floor. I grabbed my shears and rushed up the narrow staircase to my small bedroom. I stood by the window. It was closed and locked. The chimes were just outside, hanging from the neighbor's roof overhang, still silent. The grinding sound was much louder here. It was coming from the attic access panel in my ceiling. Constant scraping noise. I stood on my bed and pressed my ear against the cool plaster ceiling. The grinding stopped immediately. Complete, utter silence. And then, a sound came from right beside my head. The quiet, melodic clinking of the wind chimes. Not the whole set, just two small, individual chimes gently touching. I snapped my head toward the window. The air was completely still. The rest of the chimes weren't moving. Only two of the tubes were gently knocking against each other. And the only way those chimes could move without wind was if someone was touching them. I slowly pulled back the curtain. The sight made me gasp. The chimes weren't moving because of wind. They were moving because a thin, black wire had been slipped through the gap between the window sash and the frame. It was thin, almost invisible in the moonlight. The end of the wire was looped around two of the metal chime tubes, and the other end of the wire led across the roof toward the center of the house, right where the sanding had been coming from. Someone was on my roof using the chimes as a silent, personalized doorbell, and they were trying to draw me to the window. I backed away slowly, my eyes locked on the thin wire. Did the person who left the circle on my door send them? Or is this the next phase? The wire moved again. A slight tug, causing the two chimes to touch once more. Clink. And then, a low, wet whisper came through the tiny gap where the wire entered the room. You covered the circle, Finn, but the knock is inside now. The voice was rough, dry, and impossibly close. I screamed, a primal sound of absolute panic. I raised the heavy shears and jammed the point down into the gap, trying to snip the wire. But before I could cut it, the wire was violently yanked back. The two attached chimes snapped inward, shattering the glass of the window pane with an explosion of noise and cold air. I stumbled back, shielding my face from the glass shards. The main set of chimes, now freed from the wire's restraint, began to spin wildly in the rush of air. A deafening, chaotic clangor filled the room. And then, through the broken window, I saw it. A pair of leather-gloved hands, gripping the roof gutter. They pulled themselves up. Above them, I saw the blank, white mask of the figure from the door. It had climbed onto my roof. It had sanded a lookout hole through my attic floor. It had used the wind chimes to signal me. The figure pulled its head into my view. It wasn't holding anything, but it was staring. And the only sound, besides the still clanging chimes, was the slow, distinct swallowing sound. The dry, dusty swallow. It knew my name. It knew my number. It had marked my door. And now it had broken through my final barrier. The quiet between the knocks was over. Story 10. The ad promised quiet and privacy. A small two-room loft above an antique shop, available only for the month of October. The landlord, Mr. Silas, was a strange, gaunt man who insisted on being paid in cash and demanded that I sign a contract prohibiting me from leaving after 10 p.m. on Halloween night. I thought it was quaint. A quirky old man playing into the season. I paid the rent, moved in, and quickly regretted every naive assumption I'd made. My name is Clara. I chose this place to recover from a serious panic disorder. I needed silence and routine. The loft itself was cozy, but the floorboards creaked terribly, and the place smelled permanently of mothballs and old leather. The real oddity was the antique shop below. It was never open. Mr. Silas would come in at dusk, turn on a single dim gaslight, and then lock himself in the back room until dawn. I never heard him working. Just silence. On October 31st, the paranoia started early. I was in my tiny kitchen around 6 p.m., making tea. I heard a sound from directly beneath my feet. A deep, resonant thump. It wasn't a dropped item. It sounded like someone moving a large, heavy coffin across the stone floor of the shop below. A slow, scraping, dragging sound. Thump. Drag. Scrape. I froze, gripping the hot teapot. I hadn't heard Mr. Silas come in yet. He usually arrived closer to 7 p.m. I crept to the edge of the kitchen, right above where the sound was coming from. The floorboards were thin. I heard a soft, rhythmic clicking sound, like a combination lock being spun, but the clicks were too slow, too deliberate. And then I heard Silas's voice. It was low, muffled, and entirely too close. "Hurry now. You know the rules." I don't want to break the agreement. The sounds stopped. Silence. Absolute, heavy silence. I backed away, my heart hammering. I told myself it was just inventory. An old man rearranging heavy furniture. But the curfew in my rental agreement flashed in my mind. Must not leave the premises between 10 p.m. and 6 a.m. on October 31st. Why the curfew? And who was he talking to? I checked the front door of my loft. Locked. I checked the windows. They were painted shut. My only way out was the single wooden staircase that led directly down into the locked antique shop. I was trapped above the source of the noise. At 9:55 p.m., I was pacing my living room. I was fighting the urge to smash a window and call the police. I heard the sound of the main antique shop door closing and locking downstairs, a heavy clank of metal. And then, the single gaslight beneath me clicked on. I could see the faint yellow glow filtering up through the cracks in the floorboards. I walked over to the largest crack, knelt down, and pressed my eye against it. The view was unsettling. The main room was filled with dark, dusty furniture and strange, antique medical equipment. A display of rusted surgical tools sat on a velvet cloth. But the disturbing thing was the center of the room. Mr. Silas had cleared a large space. And in that space there were 3 massive mirrors. Floor-to-ceiling mirrors, positioned to face each other, creating an infinite tunnel of reflections. Mr. Silas was standing in the middle of them. He was wearing his usual tweed coat, but he was also wearing a perfectly smooth, black leather hood over his head. It had no eye holes, no mouth opening. It was completely featureless. He wasn't moving. He just stood there, reflected endless times in the mirrors, a line of silent, hooded figures stretching into nothingness. I yanked my eye away from the floor. My blood ran cold. This isn't inventory. This is ritual. The time hit 10 p.m., and the real horror began. From the infinite reflections, a sound emerged. It was a chorus of whispers. Faint, breathy, and overlapping. They weren't coming from below. They seemed to be coming from everywhere. From the walls, the ceiling, the air itself. It covered my ears, but it didn't help. The whispers weren't entering my ears. They were generating inside my skull. I could almost make out words. Names. My name, Clara. We're waiting. Clara. Come down. I scrambled under my heavy wooden desk, pulling my knees to my chest. My breathing was fast and shallow. It's a sound illusion, just the air conditioning. Anything but him talking to me. The whispering intensified. Now a single, clear voice detached itself from the chorus. It was Silas's voice, muffled but distinct. The contract is valid, Clara. You agreed to stay. How could he know I was upstairs? He couldn't see me. I looked down at the floor again. The yellow light from below was still shining through the crack. And then I saw the light shift. It wasn't the gaslight moving. It was a small, focused beam of light, like a pencil-thin spotlight. It was tracing a circle on the floor directly under my desk. Silas wasn't talking to me through magic. He had drilled a tiny peephole through the floor, right into my living space, and he was using a powerful, focused flashlight. I slowly lifted my head and looked straight down at the crack. I couldn't see anything but the yellow glow of the gaslight again. The focus beam was gone. But I knew where he was. He was down there, waiting. I grabbed the only weapon I had, a heavy, half-full ceramic water pitcher. I crept back to the floor crack, and with a silent, desperate prayer, I poured the entire pitcher of water directly into the crack. I heard a sharp, immediate hiss from below, followed by a violent, choking cough. The yellow gaslight flickered, then went completely dark. The antique shop was plunged into absolute blackness, and the whispering chorus vanished. Silence. Total, crushing silence. I stood there, soaked in sweat, listening to the drip of water hitting the antiques below. Had I stopped him? Then, from the bottom of the staircase that led up to my loft, I heard a new sound. A soft, slick, wet sound. It was the sound of a leather hood being slowly peeled off a wet face. A terrible, sucking noise, and then Silas's voice, no longer muffled, but clear and dangerously calm, floated up the stairs. "The contract is void now, Clara. Breach of terms. You interfered." He didn't move. He just spoke. But the sheer weight of his calm, murderous intent filled the stairwell. I wanted the silence. I wanted the compliance. Now I'll take the difference. I realized what he had been doing in the mirror room. He wasn't having a ritual. He was using the mirrors to disorient himself, to prepare his own mind for the act of murder, to detach himself from reality until the person in the hood wasn't Silas anymore. I ran to the one solid piece of furniture I had, my antique wooden dresser. I shoved it against the loft door, the wood groaning in protest. I was trapped. The windows were sealed, the stairs were blocked by a calculating madman, and the only light I had was the terrible sliver of moonlight filtering through the dusty glass. I looked around my room wildly. My mind was breaking. What was the penalty for voiding the contract? Then, I heard the sound of the door lock mechanism groaning under immense, steady pressure. He wasn't kicking it down. He was slowly, deliberately bending the metal from the inside. I huddled in the corner, holding the empty ceramic pitcher. I saw a final flash of light from the staircase. It was the single, powerful beam of his flashlight, now shining up the stairwell. And as the lock finally gave with a sharp, sickening crack, I saw the shadow of the man standing there. No hood, no mask, just Mr. Silas, his wet face gleaming in the light. He held nothing but a small, heavy brass key in his hand, a key that looked like it belonged to a massive safe. "Happy eviction, Clara," he whispered, and I knew that the real horror wasn't the spirits he was trying to contact. It was the cold, hard reality of the man who decided that the price for breaking a rental agreement on Halloween was my life.